to our ideal qualitative study with a quantitative component 6-week webinar class. William Bannon here again of Stats Whisperer, bringing you week 3 of our presentation. So this week, week 3, we will broach the essentials of qualitative analysis, qualitative data analysis, more specifically, right now. Before doing our qualitative study, any qualitative study, it's important to state why a qualitative study is needed, and there's many reasons, right? For example, as we talked about in week 1, right, there could be a very understudied topic, right, and you're just noticing it among a few people, right, and you want to find out more about it. Think about in the 80s, that's how breakdancing was discovered. Few people were saw doing it, right? Somebody went in there, they interviewed them, right? Now it's old hat, right? The same thing with any phenomenon that could occur, you know, in the medical field, in the field of psychology, anything, right? Some emerging phenomenon, right? However, in our case, right, often you need a deeper perspective from the study participant than we can gain through maybe survey research, right? So in addition to the survey, right, we might add a qualitative component to get that deeper perspective, which is what we're doing, right? Because we want to know among our community residents what's impacting their attendance in meditation class, right? So we know some of the factors, we measured them and we tested them in quantitative analysis, but we're not sure if we know all the factors, or even if the factors we do know are the most important factors, and that's what we're trying to figure out, right? The administrators want to know, right, so keep the goal of the study in mind, the administrators want to know what's the strongest predictor of class attendance. You know, have we identified it yet? Have we included it in analysis yet? That's what we're trying to find out. So believe it or not, qualitative research, right? Greatness in qualitative research is all about being Inspector Columbo. Now, Inspector Columbo was a character on TV from the 70s all the way up to 2003, played by Peter Falk. And he was one of the great probers of all time in terms of asking questions, right? This guy uncovered the truth very effectively, okay? Why? Right? He noticed, as qualitative research does, right? So this is one of the beauties of qualitative research, is getting the context of the situation down. That's what he did, right? So in police work, that's known as the 5 W's. The who, what, when, where, why, right? So whenever we do our research and we're interviewing somebody, or however we're gathering our data, we want to consider who they are, you know, what's happening, what has happened, right? Why it's happened, where it happened, what's the setting, the context, and when. You know, what was going on with the person, what was going on with the society, with the world, you know, when all this was happening, right? That's the contextual factors. We want to consider all that. We want to consider that in quantitative research too, right? But it's especially associated with qualitative research, right? So Columbo always noticed how people responded, right? So in qualitative research, if you're doing the interview, you are the interview tool, right? So a lot of gathering rich data depends on how your interaction with the person you're interviewing, right? So like Columbo, you want to notice how they respond to questions. Do they still seem to have something to say, right, before you finish up and go to the next question, and so on. You know, next, you notice breaks in logic. Well, this didn't make sense. Something seems missing there. Let me ask about that, right? All being a part of a good interviewer. And lastly, he had an economy with words, right? He He was very thoughtful in what he said. He didn't run over anybody's, speaking to him, right? He didn't talk over them. And he spoke in a very pleasant manner, which, is good, because if a homicide detective is talking to you, it might make you nervous, just like some people get nervous when they're participating in research and interviews, right? So these are all good qualities to have, right? So his probing questions, right? So he got a sense of what was going on, right? And he would continue to probe until the eventual truth surfaced, right? And that's our job in qualitative analysis, right? To gather information, ask questions until we get a proper picture of what's happening. And as you see in the poster, if he asks you more than 3 questions, you get used to the fact that you're the murderer, right? Because he had that intuitiveness, right? That instinct to tell him, where the information was and to probe into it, right? So if he was probing toward you, that's a sign, okay? Now, in our study, we're also making use of a qualitative researcher's probing questions. So we have 2 questions that will be asked of all 100 community residents. So the 100 community residents are the entire community. We're going to ask each one of them in an interview these 2 questions to answer our study questions. So first, please tell me about what things might encourage you to attend meditation class daily, right? So you see, it's succinct. It's getting at what we want to know. We want to encourage people to go to class. So we just put that in our question, right? The question should be succinct and direct, right? If it's 5 sentences long, that's not a good sign, because, the participant's probably not going to remember, what the first half of the 5 sentences was by the time you get to the last, all right? Second, we're going to ask, the administration was considering moving classes to the evening. Would that help encourage you to attend meditation class, right? So that's what we want to know. That's what they're considering. Is it a mistake? Is it a good move? We're asking the population directly. The population is 100 people, but that's what we're doing. Now, in Colombo's job, he made use of theory, right? So theory is just an idea or a set of ideas intended to explain facts or events, right? Now, qualitative research relies heavily on theories, and there are many, many of them, right? So when Colombo was using theory, right, his theory might be that, that the events have been done because of, revenge, money, a crime of passion. It is TV, for goodness sake, right? But in qualitative research, these are what our theories look like. Maybe not as entertaining, but less fatal, okay? So we have critical theory, phenomenology, right? Interactionism, right? These are like the major theories. And like I said, there are dozens and dozens, right? But what's cool about using theory in qualitative research is what's in italics here. When values are clear, decisions are easy, right? So the theory of saying how the world works often incorporates values, as in knowing this is valuable in explaining how the world works. So when you're faced with decisions in your research study, who to sample, who to interview, all these sort of things, right? When you're faced with those decisions, if the values are clear via the theory you're using, the decisions are easier, right? And that's a real strength of qualitative analysis. So Colombo's use of rules and protocol. Now, he worked for the LAPD. The LAPD, they have a department that has rules and protocol about investigations, okay? Steps to follow, do's and don'ts, right? Like do visit the scene, do interview the witnesses, right? Do's and don'ts, okay? Now, here's where our presentation begins big time. So qualitative research has rules and protocol much the same way. In qualitative research, we have guidelines for producing an effective research study. That's what we're going to review here. We're going to review the qualitative study guidelines and mainly the qualitative data analysis techniques, right? So the first thing related to qualitative data analysis is to consider the sample size of the study, right? So qualitative studies are typically associated with smaller samples, while quantitative are associated with bigger samples, right? That's almost cliche at this point, but small and big is all relative to the person saying and hearing it, right? Because there are economists who do analysis with 5, 10, 1, a million, study participants. So to them, like 1,000 people or 500 people is a small sample. But if you do qualitative analysis with 500 people, that's not a small sample in qualitative analysis, right? So small usually means 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, right? And going up from there. But how do we know how many we need, right? Well, first let's note that we're doing mixed methods, okay, in our analysis because we're doing qualitative, quantitative. That means we need enough study participants to generate statistical power to use our statistics, right? So that's determined through doing a power analysis. So the power analysis, which is quantitative, will per se say we need 80, 90, 100 people to test our research questions statistically, okay? So that might be how we're determining the sample size for this specific study, right? Because it's mixed methods, okay? But aside from statistical power, let's consider, right, if we're doing just a qualitative study, how we would pick our sample size. Okay, typically, the researcher continues sampling, right, until informational redundancy or saturation is achieved. Okay, that's the point where there's no new themes, no new information emerging from the data, i.e., it seems like everyone's sort of saying the same thing, right? And you don't have to keep interviewing people because you assume that if you interview more people, they're just going to say the same thing too, right? So that's how we know when our sample is full, informational redundancy or saturation, right? So it informs our data collection decisions, right, as in stop or go, collect more, don't collect more, right? Now here's an important statement. It's been stated, determining adequate sample size in qualitative research is ultimately a matter of judgment and expertise. So that means the person collecting the data, right, has to have the judgment and expertise, right, to be able to say when the same things are being repeated and when these themes are evident. You could imagine experience has a lot to do with that, right? You have to make small distinctions about what's being said. And it helps if you have experience, because if you've heard a lot of these data and collected a lot of these data before, you can sort of see when it starts repeating itself. So it's important to discuss what might be associated with, ending, the data collection too early, right? So in other words, saying that saturation and redundancy has been reached, prematurely, right? So one thing that might be responsible is the sampling frame is too narrow. So If you sampled a very homogeneous population and everyone starts saying the same thing in the data analysis, it might be because they're all very much the same, right? There actually might be more data out there, but the sampling is too narrow, right? So again, as we mentioned, the data analysis perspective, the data analyst perspective might be skewed or limited, right? They might not have the experience to say, or they might say it too soon, okay, we've reached saturation, right? The sampling method, right, isn't resulting in in-depth information, it's too rigid. And also, lastly, the researcher, as we said, the researcher is the tool. They have to be able to probe, right, as Colombo did, right? So this is why this is so important, right? To probe and get beyond the surface or status quo with respondents, okay? So if you ask, 100 people a question and nobody has an answer for you, right? The answers might be there, but they might not be tapped into with the people, right? Via the interview, right? That might be the problem. So it seems like everyone's saying the same thing, which might be nothing, but that might not be the actual, contextual circumstance, right? Important considerations. Much more difficult than, say, the quantitative research, right? Where we say we need 100 people, we get 100 people. This is more in depth, right? Because you have to pay attention, right? You can't lean on the numbers like in quantitative research. However, in our case, we are leaning on those numbers, right? So in our case, right, we're interviewing everybody, right? So saturation and redundancy is not an issue for us because we're interviewing all 100 people. Now, chances are that we'll have reached saturation and redundancy maybe with the first 20, 30 people, maybe even the first 3 or 4. But because they want all the people interviewed, we're going to have everyone interviewed. And we can actually look later and see when redundancy was achieved along that continuum of looking at 1 to 100, right? Which is pretty cool, okay? Now, one more thing to note, okay? In quantitative research, right, you'll see we didn't even talk about sampling, right? Why is that? It's because once the data are in, whether they're gathered through a snowball sample, a convenience sample, a random sample, and on, once the data are in, they're going to be analyzed the same way. And that might not be true of qualitative research, right? So there's a lot more discretion, a lot more nuanced, right? A lot more thinking, which is cool, right? So we're going to use convenience sampling, right? So it's kind of funny because it's almost the entire population, because the population is this one set of community residents. We're interviewing them all, so they're convenient that they're all there, but it's also everyone. Usually convenient sampling is just a small sample of people that are readily available. Everybody here is readily available. Okay, so qualitative research methodology, also very important, right? So the first one here, these are the major ones. Action research. Our study could almost be considered action research. So action research, there's an immediate problem to solve, as in, let's get everyone to meditation class. It's lots of noise pines. It's noisy. We need everyone to be more centered, right? It's good for their health, per se. Right? That's what they'll tell you, right? The second one, ethnography, right? We're participating in or observing people in the community. And then phenomenology, right? So we're studying the subjective experience of people. Grounded theory, so we're trying to do our study, develop a theory, but what we're going to call ours is case study research, where we're studying a phenomena existing, in our contextual, retirement community resident setting. Now, as we said, once the data are gathered in quantitative, right, they're usually looked at the same way. Okay, qualitative is going to be a little differently. Right? You're going to see that things like sampling or data collection, right, all these things are intimately tied with one another in qualitative research in a way they're not in quantitative research. So data collection, data analysis, and interpretation, in a word, take place iteratively, right? There's iterations, right? So all three processes are repeated together throughout the study, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Repeated together throughout the study with the aim of achieving the study goal, target, or result. This is the key to realizing saturation and redundancy, right? So in other words, you're going to data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, over and over and over, with everybody you interview, looking to see when saturation and redundancy has been achieved, okay? Important stuff. So if we were to break it down into steps, this might be what qualitative data analysis looks like. So again, step 1 is the study map, right? We always want to keep in mind, keep our eye on the prize, right? What the goal of the study is, to diagram each study question and hypothesis, right? And this is important with qualitative analysis because when you read through thousands of pages of text, you might forget the original goal, so you could always look back at your study map. Okay, then 2, right? Step 2, data collection. And here's where you see on the left, right, the blue text and blue arrows. These are the steps that are iterative, and observing them is going to tell us, give us a sense of saturation and redundancy. So data collection. So right when you're collecting it, you're looking at the coding, you're looking at themes that are emerging, right? Then step 3, you're preparing it for analysis, organizing it. You might be transcribing. If it's, recordings, transcribe it onto paper. Right? And then 4, the initial read-through. You're getting a general sense of what's going on. And then step 5, which is iterative again with data collection, you're locating segments, right? What does this segment indicate? And maybe you're assigning codes and labels to each segment, right, to see how often each one comes up. And then step 6, you're looking at the themes and codes. So you're putting those segments into smaller categories of themes and codes, right? And then step 7, you're summarizing the codes and themes, right? So as you collect the data and you see those same codes and themes come up again and again, then it looks like saturation, is being achieved. Okay. Now, here's a very interesting topic. Okay. Qualitative data analysis software, often called computer-assisted aided qualitative data analysis software. Examples are NVivo, Nudist, Atlas, right? Now these software present a lot of advantages, which is very, very nice, right? So there's things like content searching tools. So if someone volunteered for something and say it was paid, you might want to know how many times, they said money in their interview. Like, why did you volunteer? And they said, money, 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 money. So you might want to know how many times. So you could search that with the content searching tool. The thing is, though, is sometimes people, instead of money, they might say like cash, scratch, bread, something like that. And if you're content searching, it won't pick up on those, so that's why qualitative analysis, that you're often going line by line, So also coding tools, that's probably what you do most of the time in this qualitative analysis is, so if you have a survey you're scrolling through the survey. The survey is in the software, so you upload the survey in, in Vivo maybe, and you scroll through it, and as you come to certain sections, you highlight it and click it, and then it's entered into like a certain category. Sometimes they're called nodes, right? And so all the terms, so if someone says, I volunteered for this, you would highlight it and click it into the node, right? And then it's coded. That's what you do most of the time. Then mapping or networking, so you're connecting themes. So if someone says money or, things, they did it, to get gifts, you might connect the money and gifts. It's like the same theme, right? And then writing and notations. So if you're getting ideas, you can make little notes, right? Comments, all that sort of thing. So it's all real useful. But remember, this is the stuff that qualitative researchers have been doing for years, right, by hand. So these methods are not new. They're automated and electronic, for convenience, and if it works for you, for efficiency. Okay, so there you go. This is the qualitative data analysis software. Now, the thing I want to discuss is I've known lots of people who it worked for and it didn't work for. So I want to discuss, that topic. So the problem that I've seen with these most often is what I like to call out of sight, out of mind. And I didn't write that. So the thing is when you're coding in qualitative analysis, it's often necessary to see all the codes across all the surveys at the same time to recognize a theme, right? So I find it hard to do it when all the surveys are housed electronically and you have the computer screen and that's all you can see at one time. Right? So some people find it hard to impossible to recall all the hundreds of comments within, potentially thousands of pages of text all at once. Right? So there's no easy solution here. So keep that in mind. It's whatever works for you best is what you should do, right? So typically, like I said, when you're content coding in the qualitative data analysis, like the interview, you're scrolling through it. As the terms come up, you assign, you highlight them, you click it, you assign them into a certain code, right? And after you're done with analysis, the statements are combined and produced, right, when you're done coding. So if we had 3 surveys, right, so starting interview 1, 2, and 3 per se, and say these are in the qualitative data analysis software. So in study 1, you're saying, why did somebody volunteer? And you're scrolling through. And they said, I like this. So you highlight it and click it. And that goes into the node, why somebody participated. Study interview 2, you're scrolling through. I appreciate that, right? So you highlight it and click it. It goes into that list in the qualitative software. And the same thing with study 3, I enjoy so-and-so, right? So then after you're done coding, this is what the software gives you, right? Like a list of what you've selected and coded, right? Now notice that these are isolated from the rest of the data. So it's hard to see the context of each statement, as in you can't see what the person said right before and right after, right? So sometimes a bit of the context is lost. You also can't see the patterns across the interviews. So if somebody sat down and the first thing they blurted out was, I like this, right? That might be different, right, contextually, than if like somewhere midway through the interview they mentioned, yeah, I kind of like that, right? So you can't see where the statement's made and you can't see the text before and after it. So if you ever see the movie Minority Report, Tom Cruise had one of these screens, right? The mega multi-touch screen. It allowed him to have all the factors, right, associated it was actually also, he was also a detective, right? The crime he was looking at all at once. He could move them around and connect them, right? See how the elements related to one another all at the same time, right? So I found that this is what we need, well, what a lot of people need, right, when they do qualitative analysis. So the old-fashioned way, right? Before the software, people would do qualitative analysis by printing out hard copies and then using highlighted markers to code, right? So if something was a benefit, they would highlight it yellow, right? If it wasn't, they would highlight it, if it was a drawback, they would highlight it green. Any color was fine except, black. Anyway, so codes, themes, and content receive the same colors, right? And you could see across. You spread out the pages, you could see across, the same interview or all the same, how many people said the same theme, how many people said it across all the different interviews, right? So if you don't have a mega multi-touch screen, you consider using the wall. Now I know this is you don't hear this too much, but this is actually really useful for a lot of people, right? So you might pin up study participant 1 on the wall and study participant 2, 2 pages. You're reading through it, you're highlighting, green is, drawbacks, and maybe yellow you highlight and benefits, right? So the advantage is you could see everything all at once, and you could see the connections. And eventually, the wall looks like this, right? So you could see how all the codes, how they land, where they are, how frequent they are across all study participants, right, within each study all at once, right? So consider both ways. You have to judge which is the easiest way to reference cases and code comments against one another. Okay, so now another thing important to keep in mind is the list of statements produced by the software is actually very useful after content coding is done. So after coding, you want that list so you can compare all the statements. The thing is when you're making connections, it's often really useful to see everything all at once, right? To see everything spread out and how they interrelate, right? I mean, if we code benefits yellow and the whole wall is like, looks like you're staring at the sun, obviously there's a lot of benefits. But if you're looking at one thing at a time on the screen, you might not get that message as readily, okay? So, like I said, the wall method, you can see, the context of the statement, the text right before, right after, without having to go through pages, right? Because don't forget, the average person loses concentration, they say, 6 and 10 times per minute, right? So if you have a thought and then you have to actually say, oh, what did they say right before that, and go back to the hard copies or scroll through it and look, that's going to take, a minute or so. You could lose concentration, lose thought. But if it's all on the wall and you could just turn your head and look and turn your head and look, losing your concentration is less likely, right? So something to think about. So, and another thing, if you're doing mixed methods like we are, because we're brave, right, you actually have to have the qualitative data in the quantitative software, so you could do the mixed methods analysis. Because you could do qualitative analysis in quantitative software, but you can't do quantitative analysis in qualitative software, right? So that being the case, it might be more advantageous to put the qualitative data in the quantitative software right away, right? And you'll see through our analysis, right, that the same things that the qualitative software does, the content searching, coding, linking, annotation, can also be done in quantitative software like SPSS, like we'll use. So the qualitative tools can also be done in the quantitative software. All right, so here we go. We're going to start looking at our study, right? So 1, the study map, right? So the administrators want to know what encourages, right, and what drawbacks are there to class attendance, right? And we want to know our unexpected themes also. So the first research question, what encourages attendance, right? And what are the drawbacks of attendance in meditation class? And 2, what are the other unexpected themes residents report in relation to attending meditation class? All right, not too bad. And here's our study map, right? Now it looks like the other study map, but we don't list how things are measured numerically because they're not, right? So on the left, we have the benefits of attending class, drawbacks in attending class, and unexpected themes relating to attending class and their impact upon class attendance, right? Not too bad. Now next, data collection, right? So there's several sources and settings we can use, in qualitative analysis to gather data. People use individual interviews, right? Focus groups, observations, and maybe, documents, right? And you'll notice this involves direct interaction with individuals, right? Or not so much with the documents, or interaction among the individuals and noting what they're saying, right? Now, our study is going to use individual interviews,